It's time now for our second panel, which will explore the relationship between artificial intelligence and the great power competition. I'm pleased to introduce as moderator and my friend, Dr. Andrew Whiskeyman, Associate Professor, College of Information and Cyberspace at the National Defense University. Prior to this role, he served for 7 years with the U.S. Central Command. His final assignment was the Chief of the Information Operations Division at J39. Dr. Whiskeyman's area of expertise are information, warfare, strategic foresight, and emerging and disruptive technologies. His research includes the use of the theory and practice of information and warfare, coalition warfare, and multi-domain campaigning. I'll turn the discussion over now to Dr. Whiskeyman, who will introduce the panel speakers, facilitate the discussion, and lead the Q&A answer session that follows. And just for some folks that, for me to say it again, the cards on your chairs are to ask questions, and the time, just please raise your hand, and one of us will come and pick up those questions for the panelists. Thank you very much, Dr. Whiskeyman.
Hey, thank you. Thank you very much for the very introduction. So a couple of ground rules for this afternoon. Feedback was earlier, right? Better than caffeine was the quote. I have to remember that. So we're going to do some self-introductions here. Take about 5 minutes for opening remarks. I warned my fellow panelists I was going to be draconian with the timer. Not in a cruel way, but I want to keep us on track. So we'll each have 5 minutes to provide some initial thoughts about who we are, why we're here, why you ought to listen to us on this or consider what we have to say, and some opening thoughts building on the topics that have already been going on about artificial intelligence and its role in strategic or great power competition. Then we're going to stop. And it's up to you for the questions to come in, or you're going to get some canned ones for us that are not nearly as exciting or interesting of the things you've already been thinking about, or the questions that have come up from listening to the discussions already today. So don't hesitate to use those 3x5 cards to fill out your questions and bring them up here. Having done a number of different discussions, I find the most fruitful part of all of this to be that interaction. And while we don't have microphones out there to get the energy, we'll do our best to bring the energy into the questions that you ask. And that way you'll get a whole smattering of discussions. A few minutes before we're done, we'll close out with about 3 minutes each for any closing thoughts. And then hopefully it's not a one and done, but it's the start of a continuing conversation. Because as technology continues to emerge, as we continue to struggle internationally with really competing visions of how the international order ought to hang together and how different technologies play a role in that, how business plays a role in that, economy, use of military, the use of information in particular, in this case, plays a role in it. It's going to be a continuing conversation in the decades to come. So I look forward to being in that conversation with you all. I'm happy to be back. I already had my bio read of the field that I'm in this, and I could talk about AI and its implications all afternoon. But you didn't pay for your tickets to hear me talk about it. You heard for our distinguished panel of guests. So I'm going to go to my right, your left first. We'll start off with Daniel, and he'll get his 5 minutes. We'll see how well he's rehearsed that.
All right, let's see. Thank you, Andrew, and thank you to the GNSI team. I work at the U.S. Department of State in the Office of the Special Envoy for Critical and Emerging Technology. And in many ways, it feels like my office was made precisely for a conference like this. So my office was stood up about 14 months ago. I was employee number 4, although I didn't get any equity in that, unfortunately. So be it. And our mandate is to coordinate and develop policy on critical and emerging technologies across the State Department and to elevate technology as a more central feature of U.S. foreign policy. And I am the Artificial Intelligence Policy Coordinator for the department. And the office was really stood up because Secretary Blinken came into office in 2021 and felt that the department needed to be modernized to meet the challenges of the 21st century, one of them obviously being technology, and for the department to, in his words, shape the terms of the technology future. And we believe U.S. diplomacy is essential to maintaining U.S. leadership in AI in the context of strategic competition. And I want to go through the two main prongs that we think about when we address the AI challenge diplomatically. So first is to write the international rules of the road for responsible AI. This begins with our domestic framework. So we've already had a number of speakers name check the executive order on AI that the president signed in October of last year. Before that, there's the NIST AI Risk Management Framework. There's a blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights. All of this whole framework is about safe, secure, trustworthy AI, and it's a framework that we think is applicable to countries around the world, and it's important for us to be at the forefront of writing the rules so that those who do not share our values or interests aren't doing so in our absence. And so we're engaged in foreign international processes around the world, from the G7 to the G20, in the UN, in the OECD, et cetera. We can move quickly with the G7, with like-minded partners, and we can move a little bit more slowly at the UN, a little bit more slowly, but it's still essential for us to be there. And we're also thinking about how to develop norms for responsible AI in specific areas, and one that's of obvious interest to everyone here is in the context of strategic stability. So Undersecretary Bonnie Jenkins announced the political declaration on the responsible military use of AI at a conference in The Hague in February of last year. Since then, we worked with key partners around the world, and we got 52 other states to endorse this political declaration. And this is about building an inclusive approach that can accommodate and is of interest to every state around the world, because we believe every state has an interest in the responsible use of AI in the military context. And now we're beginning kind of the implementation phase for turning principles into practice. The second prong of our approach to U.S. AI diplomacy is protecting or strengthening positions of competitive advantage. So there's an obvious piece of that in terms of our export controls on hardware for advanced AI chips that are targeted to address specific national security threats. There's the executive order on outbound investment that we are developing, again, to address the flow of capital and intangibles that enables national security threats from strategic adversaries. But just as crucial to protecting positions of competitive advantage is strengthening the bonds of research and development, the flows of talent between the United States and our key allies. So we're doing this kind of on an ongoing basis, but the State Department is, and agencies from the NSF to Department of Energy are involved in this. The State Department is centrally involved in strengthening our visa process to make it easier for talent around the world to come to the United States, to stay here, because besides data and compute, people are really the most essential ingredient to AI leadership, AI strength. So to wrap up there, but just to say that our diplomacy depends not just on partners with other governments, other states, but partnering with all of you in the private sector, in academia, et cetera, because we need your ideas and your leadership to help us continue to refine our ability to do all of this. So, thank you.
That was great and right on time.
All right, no pressure.
No
for me.
pressure.
Okay. John Bansemer, and I am the director of the CyberAI project at Georgetown Center for Security and Emerging Technology, where we study predominantly artificial intelligence. My role as the director of CyberAI is looking, as kind of what the name sounds like, is looking at that intersectionality between cyber and artificial intelligence, both how artificial intelligence can improve and enhance cybersecurity, but also the kind of concerns that we should have as AI becomes more powerful. So just as a way of kind of scene setting for this particular, I'll call it a prompt, is AI is certainly having a moment right now. Right? I mean, we can look at ChatGPT and the explosion in kind of user uptick with that particular capability, but I would argue that this isn't the first time. This is actually kind of, we've seen kind of sustained kind of increases since about 2012. 2012 was when we really started to see the major breakthroughs in AI that allowed, for example, image classification at scale and with much greater accuracy than we had before. 2016, 2017, DeepMind creates AlphaGo, And I can tell you that that probably had a larger shock on the Chinese system than the LLMs of today. And that certainly, if we look at what happened after that happened and the world's greatest Go player lost, China almost immediately released their AI strategic plan. And now we are here with LLMs and generative AI. My point in laying all of this out is to suggest that we can over-index a little bit on kind of the LLMs and generative AI. Much of what we've already heard today is more good old-fashioned AI. Image classification systems, pattern recognition systems, those types of pieces that don't rely upon enormous amounts of compute. But as AI has grown, we should expect nations to try and use it for competitive advantage. Just go back into history a little bit, right? After the Wright brothers flew for the first time, within 5 years, they had a contract from the U.S. Army, right? All right, so this is not the first time that nations have seen the power of a technology and tried to apply it for strategic advantage. What is driving the current AI progress, though, is compute. Large amounts of semiconductors, and specifically GPUs, are allowing us to train larger and larger models that are far more capable than we've ever seen. Yes, they still have lots of challenges and they still have problems, but they have become much more powerful because of the amount of compute, and we can't understate what we're talking about. We're talking about training runs that are coming up into the tens of millions and soon to be hundreds of millions of dollars to train a model. At the same time, these models are diffusing. The United States does not have a monopoly on this technology. It is diffusing rapidly, and in fact, 2 of the largest open models are produced by France and the UAE, respectively. So we can see that these systems are diffusing quite quickly. How has the United States responded? We've talked about the executive order. The other part is through export controls. This is why compute has become a factor. And it's with the U.S. and its allies that have enabled this because of the IP that the U.S. has and for the strategic kind of machinery that makes the best and most powerful semiconductors possible. So ultimately, it's going to be about sustaining advantage. And here, the United States is in pretty good shape at the moment. We have a good advantage in people and talent creation. We have great data, and we also need to think about data not only in terms of the volume of data, but the types of data. And we have great amounts of various types of data that are going to be important as we develop AI. And then finally, the compute piece that I already talked about. So I'll stop there.
Excellent, well done as well. And because I'm a baseball fan and it is spring training, I'll use a baseball analogy, batting cleanup, Julian, is over to you.
Well, thank you very much. It's always a risk to be the last one on the panel because you risk of everybody has mentioned the things you want to say, but luckily it's not the case. It's actually quite a nice segue to the points that you made. So I'm Julian Mueller-Kaler. I'm actually German, so acute apologies for the accent that might occasionally slip through. And I'm the director of the Strategic Foresight Hub at the Stimson Center, a think tank in Washington, D.C., where we think about future risks and opportunities and alternative futures. So it's a practice that comes from the intelligence community, where the US has actually been one of the leading voices in the field. So we work a lot on Russia, a lot on China, a lot on AI, a lot on demography, a lot on technology. So it's an exciting job because you work on everything and different things every day. So it's a great pleasure to be here. I want to start with where you basically left it. I entirely agree that AI, the way that we understand it today, most capably in the sense of large language models, is basically a combination between data and computing power. And the reason why we have seen such explosions in the capabilities of AI models is because of increasing computing power. So when we're thinking about AI and great power competition, the current approach of the United States, particularly with regards to China, is to restrict access to computing power. And the way that you do this is through the CHIPS Act and other sorts of policies that basically try to prevent Chinese from buying and purchasing chips that are below 14 nanomillimeters. Now, I was in China a couple of months ago, and it was right at the time when they released the 7 nanomillimeter chip in a Huawei phone. I mean, it's probably not at scale yet, but they demonstrated that they are capable much faster so than anticipated to actually circumvent the sanctions or either develop those chip capabilities themselves. And there is talk, Wall Street Journal just reported this a couple of days ago, that they're working on a 5 nanomillimeter chip. In the US, that the sort of golden standard now is 3 to 2 nanomillimeters. So the US is, I agree, way ahead. But come from the point of view where I actually criticize the US policy on this, because for a variety of reasons. I think this approach that Jake Sullivan so eloquently pointed out of saying a small yard, high fence approach, in a way runs the risk of basically creating the very resilience that you're trying to prevent. I think a lot of the money that is currently been spent in increasing capacities and development of those technologies has previously been used to buy chips. So basically, all the money that went to buy American chips from companies like NVIDIA or others is now being spent by the Chinese to develop their own capabilities. Now, the assumption is basically that they're not capable of catching up. I believe that that's a flawed assumption, a dangerous assumption. A lot of the Chinese have been trained at the best American universities. If you look at PhD students for a really long time, they've stayed in the United States. The trend has reversed. A lot of them go back to China. And to just think that they are incapable of developing those technologies themselves is, I think, a dangerous assumption. Now, the question also obviously comes with regards to military applications. There's a great article in The Atlantic not too long ago where it's basically making the case that AI should never have power over nuclear codes. And it's a larger argument to say how much technology are we allowing to be in the field of decision making. And this is where I would, again, with regards to great power competition, be the narrative that I think the current framework in which basically we see a complete breakdown of the global international system and a new Cold War, particularly in the technology field, if you will, is a very dangerous approach because you see diverging standards. I think if you learn lessons from the last Cold War and how close we actually came to a complete destruction and destroyment of basically both the United States and Russia, and how often it were the decisions of humans that applied the rationale and was like, oh, well, maybe it wasn't a nuclear strike, maybe it was, a technology that gave the wrong alert, or maybe because a Russian delegation was in the United States, it can't be that they're launching right at this moment a nuclear strike, and how that actually was the preventing factor from saving us from nuclear Armageddon. If you take that human out of the decision-making loop, I think we're going to be in a world in which the dangers are far greater than we can yet anticipate. And I'm ending on this in that sense is because those large language models are become so increasingly complex that we don't even understand how they actually make decisions now because of all the big data points that John just mentioned. So that means for the military field that we need talks on strategic stability, even with adversaries, as hard as this might sound, but particularly with Russia, with China, who are working on those technologies. So I believe that the current political and international environment is very dangerous in a field that is developing at such a pace and with such great impact that we might ourselves finding, ourselves 1 year down the road where we said, well, we should have started to talk about this a lot sooner and not reflect on the mistakes that were made. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm still waiting on your cards. I know you have questions. I know somebody is furiously scribbling. Wait, they're coming in? All right, I'll go with the cards first to see what we have here. I don't know if I should shuffle and just take one or try to scan them. Can I get a vote from the audience? We'll just go with the first card up. Surprise question. I know everybody's ready. Hey, just a couple of quick things, too, that I think are important, and Julian gave us an opportunity to do this by his gentle critique of policy. It is incredibly important, especially in an environment like this, to debate the ideas and not get into the pattern of just, hey, we love AI, let's just go in a direction, right? right? We ought to be debating the ideas. And so I think it's really important to do. And hopefully the panel will have some disagreements, because that makes it fun, especially after lunch, to have a bitter about a particular idea, as opposed to just a love fest where we all agree and we should just move out to a coffee break, which I know you all forego to be here, so I appreciate that. All right. What role do middle powers play in AI and strategic competition? And you can define a middle power however you like in that. So we'll just go right down the line, especially from a policy and an engagement perspective. We'll start with you, Daniel.
Sure. So middle powers, I guess you could extend this to a range of states across the income spectrum, from low to even high income. My experience engaging with foreign interlocutors from many of these states is that they see tremendous potential and promise in AI to solve their particular development needs. And in the context of strategic competition, it's important to consider that a lot of the conversation in Washington, in Brussels, focuses on the risks and how to manage the risks from AI, which is no doubt hugely important. But a lot of other states around the world are thinking, how can we harness this technology to meet our development goals? And so as the United States is engaging in strategic competition to write the rules for responsible AI around the world, the key thing is to understand the aspirations of states like India to use AI to leapfrog up the development rankings, and to give them the best offer that we can in terms of why partnering with the United States is in their interest economically, strategically. And I think we can do that because we have so many inherent advantages that John ticked through, but also we have and I think are continuing to develop the right governance framework to do this in a responsible way that can appeal to states around the world, regardless of income and regardless of of specific strategic context in many cases. So that's how I think about it.
So, not to offend any of our European partners here, but I'll start with the EU, okay? And what I mean by that, I'm not saying that the EU is a middle power, but I am suggesting that the fact that they are setting some pretty significant standards right now on AI governance, that is going to affect how AI develops. The EU is too large to ignore from a commercial perspective for companies that are developing, and we should be very clear-eyed about this, that much of what is being developed in AI is being developed in the private sector. In fact, most of it is, right? That is where the core central kind of capabilities are. The second piece is that there are various countries that are extremely important in the supply chain of AI. The Netherlands, Germany, and others are producing exquisite pieces that are part of the overall supply chain that make this 3 and 5 nanometer technology that we're talking about. That is really, really hard to replace. And the complexity of these machines is hard to overstate. We're talking about systems that are costing over $100 million. Taiwan plays an incredibly important role in all of this. By most measures, 90% of the high-end state-of-the-art chips are produced by TSMC. So we have to recognize that all of these are kind of embedded in there. And the last one I'll say is there are many countries that are applying AI. There's no reason why the U.S. can't learn from their experiences, whether it's training, whether it's ethical approaches, whether it's working on things like explainability. All of those pieces are going to actually help the overall kind of charter the course for where AI goes.
Yeah, maybe just two things to add. We did a series where I was still at the Atlantic Council, another think tank in DC, that was funded at the time from the Rockefeller Foundation. It started in 2019, and it looked at China's role as a global citizen and how the country uses and develops AI, particularly in a development context, and was really interesting. It was, 5 years ago now. The discussion that now everybody is talking about really sort of started at the time. And we did 3 roundtables in Europe, 2 in China, and then in India and in Africa. And then sort of the pandemic hit, so that was another disaster, obviously. But what was really interesting to learn was that a lot of countries don't want to choose sides. And I think this is something that the US, in a way, underestimates. You mentioned the Dutch case, ASML, which is obviously a big provider of particularly the laser technology that is needed to produce those chips. It often comes at a huge economic cost for those countries to have to choose sides between the United States and China. I mean, quite frankly, you have to just think about that number. Every second German car is sold in China. That tells you something about the magnitude of economic dependence and interdependence that particularly European export-oriented countries have. So now if the US basically comes and extends its export control mechanism, or through the idea of when you use, I mean, they lowered the threshold from, I think, 15 to 10% of parts that are used in a machine now have to be sort of approved by the US Export Control Agency. What you basically going to see is you see a diversification of supply chains where you produce for the two biggest markets in the world separately. And I don't see the logic behind that, because what you then consequently see is a diversion of standards. And if you look at a picture and see the economic interdependence of countries, China has surpassed the United States with economic relations, particularly in the global south. So a lot of countries rely on Chinese technology. They have, 5G provided by Huawei or other solutions. So if the US is forcing that without offering real alternatives, and I think the 5G discussion was very good, because Huawei was sort of banned, but where was the American alternative at the time? I mean, now the US is capable of developing this, but at the time there was none. And then you're forcing those countries to make a decision to choose that comes at huge economic costs. I think you're finding yourself in a competitive situation that might not be beneficial for alliance building. It's a very devil's advocate approach, but I think worth considering.
That's right. I love devil's advocate's approach. So some of you may get a homework assignment out of this next question. Who here is not familiar with the Brady Bunch? Nobody's willing to self-identify as not being familiar with the Brady Bunch. Okay, kind of like I know there's some people out there also believe the Earth is flat. I know that from polling. This is not a flat Earth conference, though, so we won't go down that road. Most of my cultural references come from the 70s and 80s. And so my illusions, if you don't understand them, you'll suffer like my kids do on a Saturday night. They're forced to watch old YouTube episodes of things to understand what I'm laughing about and joking about. They laugh later. They may not thank me in the moment. But in an ode to Jan Brady, the next group of comments is all about China, China, China. And so I knew there were some Brady Bunch fans out there. But on that, how much does the shadow of China really lay over all of this discussion on AI? And would we be taking a different approach to building coalitions and cooperation, to thinking about resourcing and not only lines of communication, but the rare earth elements that involved in that, or the pursuit of technologies for a thing? Does that really drive us, and that's the backstop? Are we reacting to something, or are we attempting to lead in something? How do you see China playing into all of this? We'll start with Julian first and come back this time.
Oh boy.
And he was like, I had two people to wait to formulate through.
No, I do think actually it determines quite a lot of US foreign policy at the moment. I think it's almost a little bit like a marriage that has gone sour. You made just the joke, a reference to the 70s and 80s, so I'm too young to remember where this,
So you got some homework out of this, so that's, yeah.
But I think that there was this chimerica narrative of an opening to China, and I think on the United States part, it was combined with the expectation that China would become more like the West. And to some degree, I would argue that it has. It's very capitalistic in a lot of ways. I lived there during my studies. But in other ways, it completely hasn't. And I think from the Chinese side, there is this notion of saying, well, we promised economic opening, but we never promised political change. And so they say, now we basically want, the US just wants to keep us down. And the US is like, well, you didn't play by the rules. So it's kind of this narratives where the two countries completely talk past each other in a lot of ways. Same could be said about the one China policy, where the Chinese see it as a core element of US-China relations. And the US obviously wants to protect Taiwanese semi-independence in that sense. And it's, again, completely talking past each other. Chinese are afraid that the US is changing its one China policy officially. So I think this narrative, and I think I can say this from a European perspective, I think European powers have been far more accustomed to multipolarity. And my observation in Washington, D.C. at the moment is that this sense of unipolarity in perpetuity is a really predominant narrative. You know, U.S. national security today is not just defined by supremacy in military terms, it is also defined by supremacy in technological and economic, and in basically in a very holistic sense. Now, I think that is something very hard to maintain if you compete against a 1.3 billion people economy that is catching up and that sees its rise. If you look at the Chinese word, it's actually not rise, it means re-rise. You know, they see themselves as being sort of the center of the universe for quite some time. And, there's multiple books written about this, the rise and fall of great powers and so on and so forth. But I think, in a way, it is a very opportune time to come together and define rules of the road that enable coexistence. Now, if the predetermining factor of that coexistence is US supremacy, I don't think the Chinese will accept that. And if the vice versa is we're not going to accept the rules, that's also not going to work. But I do think, to answer your questions, China is front and center to every conversation that you have in Washington, D.C. these days.
So on that, continuing with the China thread, shifting the question just slightly, there's the theory of rising hegemonic powers almost always bring conflict. I think there were maybe 3 times in history where it didn't happen, at least by the studies that have been done on it, right? And you mentioned, Julian, that the piece of the U.S. maintaining the advantage that it has. Are we destined in a way in the Thucydides trap of a fight coming and AI just exacerbates it? Or there are ways where we can find cooperation in this space that leads us to maybe a better ecosystem for the whole world? Just curious if that one's over to
I
you.
heard Julian on that.
No. That's,
So I do think, so let me back up. I will get to your question.
so you're going to answer the question you wished you were asked.
Yeah, the answer was the one that I formulated while Julian was talking. So I do think that there is quite a bit of discussion about China. There's no doubt about it. But when you think about the discussions that are around China, they are predominantly within a national security context. Big tech is moving forward to monetize AI for a variety of reasons. There's many nations that are building their AI strategies, are building them for industrialization and economic purposes. So that's the first part. Now, are we in a Thucydides trap? Are we creating a security dilemma? To some extent, possibly, right? I would broadly characterize some of the policies as a hedging strategy to try and stay ahead of China in this regard. And there are strong reasons why that we might want to do that. Okay? First and foremost of those is kind of this whole discussion about military use cases. As far as I know, and we have military folks in play, I'm pretty sure that the DoD regulations as it relates to AI still say that a human is ultimately responsible for any use of AI systems. We do not have a comparable declaration from the part of China on that. And so those are some of the concerns that I think are raised and rightfully raised. Now, how does this create a security dilemma? China may try and find other ways to get the compute it needs. But we should also be clear-eyed to suggest that maybe LLMs and generative AI is not the breakthrough. In 2017, after AlphaGo, reinforcement learning was the piece. That's what everyone was talking about. And a little paper came out called the Transformer Architecture. And the Transformer Architecture was what is now powering generative AI. We have to be on the lookout for those types of kind of orthogonal types of directions that we may see in AI as we proceed. So I can't answer, you know, I wish I I had a crystal ball. I mean, I would just say it's possible.
And then from a pursuit of policy perspective, within the context of what we've been talking about, how do we try to set the conditions to prevent the sort of talking past each other or the Thucydides trap? If you haven't read Thucydides, you got some homework to do, you need to. Or what are the assumptions from an international relations theory perspective that underplay the sorts of policies that we take? Are we assuming a liberal world order? Are we assuming a constructivist approach? Or are we assuming, you know, realpolitik? What are some of the tools that we can use to help prevent or mitigate those potential misunderstandings that could be exacerbated by decisions using artificial intelligence?
Yeah, so John, I actually want to pick up where you just left off with LLMs, because I love your note of caution basically around technological determinism, right? The idea that there is just one path and we know the path, the future is yet to be determined. And Andrew, I'd be a pretty poor diplomat if I came up here and said that I thought conflict was inevitable. That would probably not keep me hired at the State Department for very long.
That's all right. That's good. So we have conflicting views of, and no one here has said that it's, you know, conflict is inevitable.
Understood.
But that is a narrative that's out there that, hey, you know, war is imminent and we must prepare for it. So if those are the concerns, what are some things that, you know, we ought to be doing or thinking about, not holding you to a policy decision?
Sure. So Deputy Secretary of Defense Kathix said it in her remarks that, you know, and this is in the National Security Strategy of 2022 and in the previous National Security Strategy of the previous administration, that, you know, the PRC is the power with the capacity and ability to shape the international order contrary to our interests. It's the pacing challenge. But that does not mean, and it's not the view of this administration, that therefore we can only compete. We must compete in certain areas, and we are doing that, but we also do need to find, you know, where are the areas for cooperation that serve our interests. And, you know, I think, Julian, the note of caution that you've sounded on divergent standards is an important one, right? It's the reason why we feel very invested in the political declaration on the responsible military use of AI, and why we've tried to negotiate it, construct it in a way that it could be adopted by any state around the world, right? Regardless of geopolitical context, of income level. You know, frankly, there are some countries that have endorsed the political declaration, whose the level of AI integration in their militaries is, you know, not nearly as mature as ours. But that's fine, because the principles underpinning that, you know, making sure that we have a human in the loop, as John said, in many of these key decisions, are important. And so, you know, Andrew, I don't know if I have a bumper sticker slogan for you other than there are many areas where we need to compete vigorously, and to, by the way, constantly be testing these assumptions that we have about our policy, whether it's working, and to adjust. That's the message that we've delivered with many of our competitive actions, that you know, this is the first step, there'll be more, this is not the end. But also, we need to find those areas for cooperation, because there's only one planet, and we all live on it.
So, at least until we colonize Mars, but that might be a little ways off. So, the next group of questions have largely fallen into two buckets, and they're variations on the theme. So I'm not going to read each one individually, but I'll try to amalgamate them a little bit. They fall into the camp, a lot of questions on information, particularly from a disinformation theme, which I know there's a panel coming up on that, and the use of AI to exacerbate those challenges, particularly looking inward when it comes to freedom of speech issues, how you draw the line when your adversaries don't necessarily conceptualize that the same way, or they don't view objective and subjective truth the same way that perhaps the U.S. tries to do. And the second group of questions comes into really enforcement mechanisms in terms of, so we get some international cooperation on something, but that's already the people who are willing to cooperate. The folks that aren't going to, and there's no method of putting them into that piece, which gets after those international relations assumptions about how nations hang together too, right? Is it realist? Is it, does cooperation breed cooperation, et cetera? So pick one or the other. I'll start with you this time. Is something on the information end or something on what's the mechanism for enforcement or the mechanism for encouraging cooperation within constraints? Governance.
I'll do enforcement. Thank you. At least I got to choose, right? Henry Kissinger, about 3 or 4 years ago, before he passed away, wrote an article in The Atlantic. And it was an interesting piece because it covered much of this question. And so I'll pull a little bit from that. And what he talked about was trying to pull from the nuclear analogy as it relates to AI. And one other thing, I just have to stop for a second. The fact that he wanted to learn about AI at 95 is just amazing to me, right? I mean, talk about a lifelong learner. I mean, it was just incredible. So he dedicates and learns about AI, and what he understood were some fundamental principles about AI. It is far more difficult to verify compliance on AI. Imagine a drone that's flying. Does it have AI on it or not? I don't know, right? So these are some of the challenges. The second piece is, in terms of enforcement, is the difficulty of diffusion. I already talked about the fact that these are open models. The algorithms are relatively simple now that they've been created. The amount of code that it takes to actually create many of the AI systems is in the hundreds to a few thousand lines of code. This is not significant IP from that perspective. What makes it special is the training and those types of pieces. So that diffusion and that difficulty in verification in terms of understanding how and if it's being used, I think will continue to be really, really challenging in this regard.
Sure.
You can pick the same one or a different one.
No, that's all right, Dr. Whiskeyman. I'll try to answer both in a sense. One of the challenges for AI diplomats like myself is that we can't outrun our technical understanding, and by our I mean sort of the broad AI policymaking community, our technical understanding of AI and different kinds of governance mechanisms or tools for trustworthy AI. So it's important in both of these questions. So in the kind of information space, right, there's a lot of discussion around the problem of mis and disinformation enabled by AI, but there's also broad agreement, in fact, near consensus, that we need tools for content authentication and provenance. And so there's consensus on that point, but there's not yet a firm technical basis for how to do this in a reliable way for images, video, audio. Yeah, John's vigorously nodding his head, right? So in some sense, we've all almost reached the limit of our ability to do that in a diplomatic context. Now, there's still things that we as diplomats are pushing on this to get other, we are committed to eventually watermarking, U.S. government produced content so that, our content appears as trustworthy in the kind of information space, and we hope other governments will do this down the road. So there's things that we can do again around solidifying these norms, but we can't outrun the technical understanding of the technology and what we can do to ensure it's safe, secure, trustworthy. That also applies to enforcement, right? We could have even if we thought it was a good idea to quote unquote stop the diffusion of AI, it doesn't appear to me like we have yet developed the necessary toolkit. And the U.S. government is working very hard on all this. So the U.S. AI Safety Institute, that's housed under NIST at the Department of Commerce, is developing a lot of the standards and evaluations and tools for trustworthy AI, so that we can actually address the challenges that we see today and ones that I'm sure will come down the road in terms of AI. But we need that technical understanding, really, in both of these kinds of problems.
Allow me to make one rejoinder to the strategic point and to the previous discussion, and then focus on the information angle, because I think it's key. Strategic foresight is not about determinism, right? It's about the illustration of alternative futures. You know this. And it's because you want to illustrate of what kind of potential future we are ending up to highlight the importance of good decision making in the here and now. And you said that the military is preparing for war. Absolutely, it's doing that because it's supposed to do that. But you also have the generals who are warning against wars because it's the soldiers that die in the trenches and not the politicians that send them there. And I think that's an important aspect of that decision making, of really being clear about the costs of policy making in every aspect. Just wanted to say that because I think it's important. Your question about information, I think, is absolutely key. I am incredibly worried that if I were to say, choose one word or concept that matters in the next 5 to 10 years, it is really the concept of truth. And I can encourage all of you as students to read Hannah Arendt, who wrote much about my own country and how the concept of truth was demolished and what it led to, not just for the country itself, but for the world. And she says a very powerful thing. She says if the concept of truth is demolished and the truth is no longer a succeeding factor in a debate, the political show is the only thing that matters. And people don't start believing lies, they start to question the concept of truth altogether. Now, I think it's nice if the US government is putting out watermarked documents that say this is from the US government. The problem is not that. The problem is that nobody trusts, or like a large part of the population doesn't trust the US government anymore. So we are already in a very low trust environment. And as a matter of fact, Barry Eichengreen from Berkeley has research out that the biggest or its most sincere correlation between people voting for populist figures is lack of trust in democratic institutions. It's much more than age, migration environment, economic situation, so on and so forth. It's trust. So we are already in a very low trust society, and yet what we do with generative AI is we add capabilities that for a really long time we could trust images and we could trust videos, and we can no longer do that. We cannot even trust the voices of people anymore with deepfakes. There was this Hong Kong billionaire that got tricked into transferring $25 million because on a video call, his CEO told him to do that, but it wasn't the real CEO. So I think we're living in a world in which capabilities are being added and fairly easy accessible, that just you're gonna have to watermark the real stuff instead of watermarking AI things, because you're gonna be so flooded by AI generated images, texts, videos, you name it, that ultimately it's a question of literacy, it's a question of education, it's a question of basically not believing anything that you see anymore. And then subsequently, the question comes up, who regulates that? And then we are in George Orwell's 1984. Do you want to have a ministry of truth? I mean, do we want to leave it to private sector companies? And that is the fund. I think ultimately it's coming down to person-to-person relationships. You can't trust anything other than somebody speaking face-to-face. And we can't even trust humans, right? We're also worried that AIs lie to us. Well, where did they get it from? I mean, we're not the most honest species on the face of the earth either, right? So we expect AI to be much better than we ourselves are, but it's learning the language from us. Yes, I'm really, really worried about that.
So you've come to the end of a perfectly good hour. I'm going to give everybody a quick minute to wrap up before we turn over and get the hook off. But I promised you we'd have way more to talk about than we could cover in an hour. And real quickly, any closing comments or thoughts as we wrap up? Daniel, we'll start with you.
Just to say, first of all, thank you to the GNSI team again for bringing us together, and thank you to the panelists. I've learned a ton, and just to say that, again, partners like you in the room are essential to us in the US government being able to execute on our mission effectively, because we need to test our assumptions, test our ideas to get effective pushback from people 2 seats down from us up here on the stadium. No, but in all seriousness, it's tremendously important because it's a critical mission, and AI is transforming the world. It's transforming the nature of our relations with other countries, and it's central to our future and our ability to shape the future as a nation according to our interests and values. So we really depend on all of you. Thanks.
Thanks.
And I really appreciate the opportunity to be on this panel with my panelists, because it's such an important topic, right? And I'll go back to the point that I made at the very beginning, which is generative AI and what we have seen has been really phenomenal in terms of what we have been able to see. But once you peer underneath the hood a little bit more, you see the failure modes that are pretty significant as it relates to generative AI. It may be the path towards future, more capable AI systems, or it may not. We still have to see, and there's still plenty of other types of AI that are going to be particularly helpful in a DoD context.
Yeah, I want to echo the appreciation for being here. Thank you so very much. You know, I think that AI, we've talked a lot about the risks, but AI also has amazing opportunities, right? It can help us to be more productive. It can help us to find drugs that fight diseases. It can help us to live longer, ultimately. And I think it's key to harness those technologies because it's a tool, right? It's not a self-fulfilling prophecy. And for as long as humans have existed, they've used tools for good things and for bad things. And I think that you know, I choose to come here. I choose to live in the United States. I choose to pursue my education here because I do want to live here. And I think that the open, free approach is the one that ultimately is a more successful version. We just ought to do everything to protect it and protect it from the dangers that lie outside and within. And discussions like this, I think, are a good start. Thank you.
Yeah, and then just finally, a couple thoughts of wrap up before we end the session. Somebody a whole lot more famous than me once asked a question, quid est veritas, right? What is truth? And as we wrestle with what technology brings, particularly with generative AI, and a lot of the things that we've been talking about here, particularly on the information thread, how do we know what is true? How do we come to that determination to share? That is not a new question. Right? The ancient Greeks, from a Western philosophy perspective, wrestled with that. Aristotle wrestled with it. Albert the Great, Aquinas, Aristotle. This episode brought to you by the letter A. I see some folks were Sesame Street fans. Good. So I think there's a nexus here between the scientific and the engineering community focused on what the tech does and the traditional liberal arts community, which really included science up until recently, coming together to think about those things, but because it is the nexus of the human and the machine in this case, and how we work together in this space to wrestle with problems we've had for centuries in terms of security, cooperation, how do we build a more peaceful world, and how do we use technology to build up rather than tear down. And with that, it should be a good set for the disinformation panel, because a lot to unpack there. Thank you very much for your time and your attention this afternoon. It's been a pleasure.